It broke my heart, but it opened my eyes. When Jonas heard Lucas's words, the world around him collapsed. The betrayal in the middle of the crowd hurt more than any physical blow. Yet at that very moment he realized, the real battle is not in the laboratory, but inside ourselves, the battle for the right to be who we are, even when the whole world laughs. George was the kind of student who seemed to carry the entire weight of responsibility on his shoulders. At the University of Nevada, his professors recognized him as the most disciplined, the most reliable, the one who never forgot a single detail. His notebooks were filled with immaculate handwriting, equations neatly aligned, and margins free of any mistakes. Every lab assignment was prepared in advance. Every reading completed days before the deadline. He had built a reputation not just as a hard worker, but as someone who treated his studies almost as a sacred duty. Rules and discipline were not just habits for George. They were the very pillars of his existence. Lucas, however, was the opposite. Where George's life was a straight line of discipline, Lucas's life was chaos, curves, and sudden turns. His reputation on campus was well known. He was the disruptive force in every classroom, the one who arrived late, threw around careless jokes, and treated professors as though they were part of a comedy routine. He rarely carried his books, often borrowed equipment, and made it a point to test the patience of everyone around him. Some admired his audacity, others despised it, but everyone agreed on one thing. Lucas was unpredictable. The collision of these two worlds came suddenly, without warning. The professor of their science class announced that the final project would not be done individually, as many had hoped, but in pairs. Names were drawn, and murmurs filled the room. George sat upright, his heart beating faster with a mixture of hope and tension. He prayed for a partner who would share his dedication, someone who would respect the rules as much as he did. The project was not a minor detail in the syllabus. It carried nearly half the semester's grade. For George, this wasn't just another assignment. It was an opportunity to prove once more that he deserved his place, that his future in science was secured. And then the professor called the names. The first one was George. He adjusted his posture, pen poised to write down the name of his partner. The second name landed like a thunderclap. Lucas. The classroom reacted instantly. A ripple of laughter, mocking whispers, students nudging each other with amused smirks. Everyone knew what kind of student Lucas was, and everyone also knew how obsessively serious George was about his work. The contrast was too sharp, too obvious, and the entire class seemed to revel in the irony. George felt his chest tighten. He kept his expression neutral, face carefully composed, but his mind was racing. Of all possible partners, why him? Why Lucas? It felt not just like bad luck, but like sabotage, as though fate had decided to test him in the cruelest possible way. This project could not fail. His future, his reputation, everything he had worked so hard for depended on it. And now, half of his grade, half of his effort, rested in the hands of a boy who treated life as a joke. Lucas, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair with a grin that stretched wider the more uncomfortable George became. He stretched lazily, tapped his pencil against the desk, and said loudly enough for half the class to hear, "Guess we're partners, genius." The words were not just casual, they were designed to provoke, to turn George's seriousness into entertainment for the rest of the room. The laughter that followed wasn't just about the pairing. It was about the spectacle of watching two opposites forced together. George didn't respond. He lowered his eyes to his notebook, writing something just to give his hands a task, anything to avoid the satisfaction Lucas might gain from his reaction. But his silence only added to the tension, a silence louder than words. As the professor continued announcing other pairs, George's thoughts spiraled. He saw weeks of late nights erased by careless mistakes, hours of precision ruined by clumsy hands, data turned into nonsense by someone who didn't care. Lucas represented disorder, failure, risk, everything George had spent years avoiding. When the class ended and students began to leave, Lucas strolled past George's desk, his bag slung carelessly over one shoulder. He tapped George's notebook with two fingers and, with exaggerated seriousness, said, "Don't worry, Professor. I'll make sure we pass." The sarcasm was obvious, the smirk sharp, and the words carried the weight of a promise. A promise that this partnership would be anything but easy. For George, the tension was suffocating. This was not simply about grades anymore. It was about control, about order, about protecting himself from the chaos that Lucas embodied. For Lucas, however, it was entertainment, a stage, an opportunity to test how far he could push the perfect student before he snapped. And so the line was drawn. In that single moment, in that single assignment, two worlds collided. Order against chaos, discipline against rebellion. Neither of them knew just how much this forced partnership would demand from them, nor how much it would reveal. But both could already feel the storm brewing, and neither was willing to back down. The laboratory became a battlefield of silence, glances, and small provocations. George arrived early, as always, setting up the table with meticulous care, arranging the glassware in a neat row, checking the labels twice, preparing everything as though he were about to conduct an exam in front of the entire faculty. Lucas entered late, dragging his feet across the floor, his coat half-buttoned, his goggles dangling in his hand, the grin plastered across his face, announcing trouble before he even spoke a word. He dropped his bag on the ground with a loud thud, leaned casually against the bench, and scanned the equipment with mock curiosity. "So, Professor," he murmured with a smirk, "what magic potion are we brewing today?" His voice was meant to cut, to stir laughter from anyone close enough to hear. George's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply measured out the first chemical, counting each drop with precision, refusing to give Lucas the reaction he so clearly wanted. The tension was palpable, filling every inch of the air between them. George's silence, however, seemed to provoke Lucas even more. The boy tapped his pencil against the desk in a restless rhythm, humming under his breath, and when asked to record a measurement, he deliberately wrote down the wrong number. George's eyes flashed, his patience cracking, as he snatched the thermometer back and corrected the mistake himself. "If you don't care," George muttered, voice low but sharp, "then get out of the way. Some of us are actually trying to learn." The words hung in the air like a spark, and for the first time Lucas didn't laugh. He leaned back, eyes narrowing, the grin fading just slightly, revealing a flicker of something darker, heavier. The professor glanced over but did not intervene, and the rest of the class pretended not to notice, though whispers had already begun to stir. It was then that George saw it. The mask slipped for just a second, almost too quick to catch. Lucas's hand stilled, his eyes fixed not on the bubbling liquid in the flask, but somewhere far beyond, as though the room had vanished around him. His voice dropped, stripped of its mockery, and he said quietly enough for only George to hear, "Do you know why I mess things up? Because if I don't, no one looks at me. Silence means I disappear." His words struck George harder than any insult ever could. For the first time, the swagger, the jokes, the rebellious grin, all of it cracked open, revealing not a clown or a troublemaker, but someone desperately afraid of being invisible. Lucas looked exhausted, not lazy. Fragile, not arrogant. George froze, torn between disbelief and a strange, unfamiliar recognition. He had always assumed Lucas was nothing more than chaos for the sake of chaos, someone who thrived on ruining order. But now he saw the loneliness behind the performance, the fear of emptiness disguised as arrogance. The flask hissed softly on the burner, vapor curling upward in thin streams, but neither of them paid it any attention. The real reaction was happening between them, a volatile mix of discipline and rebellion, silence and confession, order and vulnerability. From that moment, something changed. Their clashes softened, though not completely. George still corrected every mistake with stern precision, but he noticed Lucas began trying. He measured chemicals more carefully, asked hesitant questions, and even scribbled notes when he thought no one was watching. The sarcasm didn't vanish entirely, but it grew thinner, less biting, replaced at times by long silences filled with tension neither of them dared to name. Sometimes George would catch Lucas staring at him, not with mockery, but with something unreadable, heavy, as if he were searching for proof that his secret had not been betrayed. George himself began to change too. The silence that once felt like a shield now carried a different weight, charged and fragile. He found himself listening for Lucas's voice, even when it wasn't filled with jokes. He noticed the way Lucas's fingers tapped, not out of boredom, but out of nervous energy, the way his bravado slipped when no one else was looking. Their arguments became shorter, their eye contact longer, and the space between them, once filled with disdain, now hummed with something dangerous and unspoken. Still, neither dared to acknowledge it aloud. The classroom remained hostile, whispers circling like vultures, but George and Lucas had built a fragile truce, an invisible thread pulling them closer. For George, it was unsettling to realize that beneath the chaos he had once despised, there was a boy who wanted, perhaps needed, to be seen. For Lucas, it was terrifying to let anyone glimpse the truth behind a mask. But in the unsteady silence of the lab, in the clash of formulas and firelight, the mask had already cracked. The laboratory that had once become a fragile truce between George and Lucas slowly turned into a stage for the crowd. Their classmates had noticed the shift. Lucas, the boy who used to sabotage everything, was suddenly measuring chemicals with care. George, the perfectionist, no longer flinched at every careless movement. At first the comments were small, whispered between benches, disguised as jokes. Look at that. The genius tamed the rebel. Maybe Lucas finally borrowed a brain. The words floated around them like smoke, hard to ignore, but easy enough to pretend they hadn't heard. George focused on the data sheets, forcing himself to believe the work would silence them in the end. Lucas only grinned, though his eyes sometimes flickered in a way that suggested the whispers reached deeper than he wanted to admit. But whispers have a way of turning sharper, louder, and soon the room was alive with laughter at their expense. Every time they walked in together, someone muttered something just loud enough for others to hear. What a pair, the brainiac and the clown. Sometimes it came with chuckles, sometimes with sneers, but always with the same venom. George's skin burned under the attention. He had never liked eyes on him. He had built his life on invisibility, on order, on silence. Now his name was tied to Lucas's in every cruel remark, as though the work they had built was nothing more than a punchline. He endured it, telling himself Lucas would too. After all, Lucas had shown effort, sincerity, even glimpses of vulnerability. Surely he would not let the crowd's noise undo everything. But George underestimated the weight of reputation. One afternoon, the experiment ran perfectly, every number aligned, every observation precise. For a brief moment, George felt something he rarely allowed himself: pride. He turned to Lucas, ready to share it, but before he could speak, a voice from the back of the room cut through the air. Look at them, the genius and the clown. What a romantic couple of science. Laughter erupted, louder than ever, bouncing off the walls, filling every corner of the room with ridicule. Students leaned forward, grins plastered across their faces, enjoying the spectacle. The mockery wasn't just a joke anymore. It was a weapon, dissecting them, turning their fragile partnership into a scandal. George froze, the pen still in his hand, the weight of every eye pressing down on him like a physical force. His chest tightened, but he kept his face still, his hands steady. He told himself Lucas would react, would shrug it off, maybe even defend what they had built. But instead, Lucas threw back his head and laughed louder than anyone. The sound was sharp, hollow, cruel. He leaned back in his chair, voice raised above the crowd, and said with deliberate clarity, "Don't get twisted. I'm not really working with him. He does everything himself. I just let him because why not? Saves me the trouble." The room exploded with laughter again, crueler this time, delighted at the spectacle. For the crowd, it was entertainment, a show to break the monotony of class. For George, it was a knife. The words cut deeper than any insult had before, deeper than the mockery of strangers. Because it wasn't just the class betraying him, it was Lucas, the boy who had once confessed his loneliness, who had admitted he wore a mask to hide his fear, had chosen the mask again. He had chosen the safety of mockery over the truth they had shared in the quiet corners of the lab. George felt the betrayal like a physical blow. He did not let his face reveal it. He would not give Lucas or the others the satisfaction. He continued writing in his notebook with rigid precision, each stroke of the pen deliberate, mechanical, as if the order of the page could hold back the chaos tearing through his chest. But inside, everything collapsed. The trust he had dared to build, the fragile connection, the silent glances, all of it shattered in a single moment. Lucas's laughter echoed in his head long after it faded from the room. The days that followed turned heavy with silence. In the lab, they spoke only of measurements and results, clipped words, formal tones, strangers sharing a bench. George buried himself in his notes, never lifting his eyes longer than necessary. Lucas, for his part, slipped easily back into his mask, cracking jokes with others, playing the rebel again as though nothing had changed. To anyone watching, they were simply two students assigned by chance, nothing more. But beneath the surface, tension poisoned every second, every glance, every unspoken word. At night, George replayed the moment again and again. The smirk on Lucas's face, the laughter that followed, the words that erased everything. He could endure the cruelty of classmates. He had endured ridicule before. But Lucas's choice cut differently. It wasn't just humiliation. It was betrayal. And no formula, no equation, no precise calculation could repair the fracture it left behind. The weeks that followed were suffocating in their silence. The partnership that had once felt like a dangerous truce now resembled a battlefield after the smoke had cleared, quiet, cold, littered with the ruins of trust. In the lab, George and Lucas spoke only when absolutely necessary, their words clipped and functional. Temperature. Record this. Stir slowly. There was no laughter, no careless provocation, no accidental warmth. George forced his focus into the pages of his notebook, burying himself in neat columns of data, but the memory of betrayal clung to him like a shadow. Every time Lucas cracked a joke with someone else, every time he smirked in the way the class expected him to, George felt that sharp echo of humiliation in his chest. He had been foolish to believe in anything more than chaos. Then, one late evening when most students had already retreated to their dorms, a hesitant knock broke the quiet of George's room. He sat frozen for a moment, debating whether to open it, until the knock came again, softer this time, almost reluctant. When he finally opened the door, Lucas stood there, shoulders tense, his usual grin gone. There was no sarcasm on his lips, no mask of rebellion in his eyes, just a raw, uneasy vulnerability that George had never seen linger for so long. For a long moment neither spoke, the silence between them heavy with everything that had been left unsaid. "I can't keep doing this," Lucas finally muttered, voice low, rough, stripped of its usual bravado. He stepped inside without waiting for permission, closing the door quietly behind him as though afraid the hallway itself might overhear. His hands ran through his hair in a restless motion, his body restless, his tone cracking with exhaustion. "All that stuff I do, the clown, the troublemaker, the guy who doesn't care, it's all fake. Every bit of it. And I'm so damn tired of it." George watched him carefully, torn between suspicion and the dangerous flicker of something like hope. He wanted to stay guarded, to shield himself from another wound, but Lucas's words carried a weight that was impossible to dismiss. Lucas took a shaky breath, forcing the confession out as though it cost him something to say it aloud. "I'm not scared of silence," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I'm scared of myself. Scared that if I stop playing the part, there'll be nothing underneath worth seeing. That if I drop the mask, no one will want to look twice." The words pierced through George more deeply than he expected. He had always imagined Lucas's arrogance was impenetrable, that his laughter was endless. To see him stripped of it, standing raw and bare in the dim light, was disorienting. It was like looking at a stranger wearing the same face. Lucas's gaze dropped to the floor, his voice cracking further as he continued. "That day in the lab, when they laughed, I thought if I joined them, if I laughed too, I could protect myself. Keep the reputation. Keep the part everyone expects me to play. but it didn't protect me. It made me feel empty, and I hate myself for it. The confession lingered in the room, heavy and unrelenting. George felt his chest tighten, not with the rage he had carried for weeks, but with something harder to define. He had imagined this moment in 100 bitter ways. Lucas mocking him again, Lucas shrugging it off, Lucas pretending it never happened, but not this. Not the boy unraveling in front of him, admitting that the laughter he had chosen over their fragile truth had only deepened his own prison. "I don't want to hide anymore," Lucas whispered, finally raising his eyes. And for the first time, there was no performance in them, no spark of defiance, only a raw determination edged with fear. "Not from them. Not from you. Not from myself." George swallowed hard, his instincts screaming to retreat, to protect what little remained of his trust. But the sincerity in Lucas's voice pressed against that instinct, forcing him to see not the rebel, not the troublemaker, but a boy who had been carrying the weight of other people's expectations until it broke him. He had not come here for pity. He had come here for freedom. "And what happens?" George asked quietly, his voice steady, but his heart unsteady, "when they laugh again. When the whole class turns on you for good." Lucas didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, his voice steady for the first time. "Then let them. I'd rather lose everything than go back to pretending." The silence that followed was electric, charged with risk and possibility. George let it stretch, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement of the courage it had taken to speak. He had seen Lucas wear 100 masks, heard 100 lies spoken like jokes, but this truth was louder than all of it. He did not answer immediately, but his stillness said enough. Lucas had finally dropped the act, and in that raw, trembling honesty, George saw not a clown, not a rebel, but a person desperate to be free. The final presentation arrived with the weight of weeks pressing behind it. Every late night, every silent hour in the lab, every unspoken word between George and Lucas had built toward this moment. The classroom was unusually still as groups prepared to demonstrate their results, the air thick with tension. George sat upright, his notes stacked neatly in front of him, every calculation rehearsed, every line of data prepared to perfection. Yet for once, he did not feel the crushing isolation that usually came with responsibility. Lucas stood beside him, steady, quiet, no trace of the mocking grin that had once been his armor. For George, that presence was enough to ground him, a reminder that they were no longer two enemies forced together, but two people who had chosen to remain standing side by side. When their turn came, George spoke with his usual precision, explaining the methods, pointing to the balanced equations and the flawless data tables. Lucas, to everyone's surprise, handled his part without bravado. He passed the equipment smoothly, adjusted the flame when needed, and even recorded values with care. There was no spectacle, no attempt at attention. For the first time, his silence was not an act of defiance, but a sign of commitment. Together, they moved with a rhythm born of hard-earned trust. The professor examined their results with a critical eye, flipping through the pages, testing their experiment, watching the consistency of their demonstration. Finally, he set the report down and nodded with a rare softness. "Excellent work," he said. "One of the strongest submissions this semester." The words carried more than praise. They carried recognition. George felt warmth flood through him at the validation, but his attention shifted almost instantly to Lucas. The boy who had once sought laughter as survival now stood quietly, shoulders squared, lips pressed into the faintest of smiles. Not the smirk of a rebel, but the small, private satisfaction of someone who had finally allowed himself to believe he was capable of more. But the room around them was not as generous. Whispers rippled like poison, spreading quickly across the benches. Yes, the clown turned into the teacher's pet. So much for the bad boy. Some students laughed outright, their voices sharp, mocking, eager to reclaim the version of Lucas that entertained them. Others exchanged looks of disappointment, as though his success was a betrayal of the image they had come to expect. The jeers grew, not loud enough to be an open revolt, but constant, cutting, designed to remind him of his place. George felt his chest tighten, anger boiling beneath the surface. He wanted to defend him, to silence the whispers, but before he could speak, he saw something that stopped him. Lucas didn't laugh. He didn't join them. He didn't put the mask back on. Instead, he stood still, his jaw tense, his eyes steady, facing the room with a quiet defiance that was louder than any comeback. He let the cruelty pass over him without feeding it, refusing the only currency he had ever relied on, the approval of the crowd. The shift was subtle but profound. The so-called friends who had once cheered his antics now turned their backs. In the cafeteria, they chose different tables. In the corridors, their greetings became smirks or silence. Slowly, deliberately, they exiled him, stripping away the identity he had clung to for so long. And yet Lucas did not collapse beneath it. He did not run back to the mask or beg for their acceptance. Instead, he carried the rejection like a scar, painful but freeing. For the first time, he belonged to no one but himself. George saw in the way Lucas walked into the lab the following days, no longer loud, no longer demanding attention. He leaned against the bench without performance, his silence no longer empty but grounded. And when their eyes met, there was no need for words. It was not for the class, not for the professor, not for anyone else. It was for each other, for the fragile truth they had managed to protect when everything else had tried to break it. Rumors still spread, cruel voices still whispered, but neither of them reacted the way they once had. George no longer shrank from the attention, and Lucas no longer drowned it out with laughter. They endured it together, the storm outside, their fragile truce no longer enough to shake it apart. It wasn't perfect. George still built his world on order. Lucas still wrestled with impulses that clawed at him, and the weight of judgment still hung heavy. But in their differences, they found something neither had known before: strength. For George, silence shared was no longer a prison, but a refuge. For Lucas, living without a mask was terrifying, but it was also the first breath of freedom. The world mocked, the world judged, the world tried to push them back into roles it could understand. But for the first time, neither of them asked for its permission. What they had was fragile, perhaps temporary, but it was real. And in that reality, both of them discovered a freedom that felt stronger than the laughter of any crowd.